Culture has a lot of impact on behavior. When I'm in the field, I know I've made mistakes, but I learn from them. Communication is key to learning from your mistakes. So before we learn how to communicate, we need to learn about different cultural identities and what makes them important to each individual culture we work within. I'm here with Melinda Kane. Melinda, can you introduce yourself and tell us about your work with cultural awareness and EWB?
My mother was a teacher, and so I experienced educational travel at a very early age. I was also academically and professionally involved with programs overseas with U.S. Agency for International Development. I also have been an adjunct professor at several universities, and through these experiences I was able to work with several EWB chapters. And throughout this work I realized that cultural challenges require practical, real-world solutions. Therefore, I'm the founder and managing director of an organization that helps companies and people work better together through a customized toolkit that enhances intercultural competence.
So in your work with the cultural awareness, how do you get your clients to understand the concept of culture?
Well, we actually start off with an interesting example. And when you wear your shoes, you don't put them on thinking in the morning. They're very automatic. And so shoes are similar to cultural identities. So the first exercise we have people do is to take their left shoe off and put it on the right foot, right shoe on your left foot. And it tends to be very uncomfortable and people complain about it. And so we use the analogy that walking a mile in another person's shoes can help you understand different cultural references. And if that other person would step into your shoes, both of you can build bridges of understanding that enhance relationships and build trust so that you can work better together.
Melinda, could you define culture and give us some examples of different types of culture?
You have a lot of different shoes, you have a lot of different cultural identities. One might be nationality, ethnicity, gender, age, religion. There are also professional identities, and there can be organizational identities. So all of these provide different shoes or different views of seeing the world. Definition of culture includes attitudes, values, and beliefs that are shared by a particular group that gives you a sense of belonging, a sense of identity. The last one that I think is helpful is looking at the worldview. So it's the way you understand and interpret the world. So the worldview can be very important in dealing with other cultures. I also wanted to add the caveat that stereotypes are not useful. However, generalizing cultural identities, having a framework to understand a culture, can be extremely important in helping you navigate a new culture. It's also important to realize that individuals are always important. So you may have to focus on the individual within that culture to see what they embody of the culture or not.
Can you tell us about culture and behavior and how they're related? And give us some examples of how they show up in reality.
Well, I'd like to use the example of an iceberg. There's about 85 to 90% of an iceberg that's under the surface of the water. And if you use the analogy of culture and the iceberg, a lot of the culture, the values, attitudes, and beliefs are under the surface, and that drives the top of the iceberg, which you see, the visible culture, the behavior. To illustrate the values, attitudes, and beliefs below the surface of a culture, there are 5 cultural value dimensions that are important to consider. They are identity, communication style, power distance, uncertainty avoidance, and time. One particular example would be an engineer who goes into a community to try to help the village. Well, that engineer is very, very influential and viewed at the top of the hierarchy. And in asking questions, you may not get people to tell you the information that you want. So you have to figure out ways to build bridges of understanding with different people in the community so that they feel comfortable telling you what you need to know, not what you want to hear.
In my experience, cultural differences is not that simple. Can you explain the complexity?
Behavior is very complex. So for example, not all behavior is cultural. So you need to think about a continuum of behavior. And so on one end, there's universal human behavior. In the middle, there's cultural behavior. And on the other end, there's individual behavior. So as an example, human behavior, we all eat to survive. Cultural behavior, there may be differences in what you eat and how you eat, what time you eat. And then on the individual side, individual preference for either more seasoning or not doing a particular ritual. So what's important is to consider behavior somewhere along the continuum and then use the tools to better understand the cultural behavior, or then even learn more about personality and individual experience in order to understand why an individual would react a certain way.
Given the complexity of culture, how do you suggest we look at relationships between cultures?
I think it's important to understand that different cultures build relationships very differently. One way is to bring Lola with you, and that is L means to learn about the culture, its people, its cultural beliefs before you arrive. Second, the O is to observe what's going on around you, kind of like a GoPro camera on your head. L means to listen to what people are saying, learn as much of the language as possible. And then A is to ask questions before you act. Another technique is to use the platinum rule. And the platinum rule is to treat others as they want to be treated. So for example, some cultures don't use eye contact as a manner of respect. Sometimes looking away from you is much more respectful. So once you learn that, then you need to treat others that way in order to be respected in the community.